scripture this morning. Our passage comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 9. We'll be reading verses 35 through 41. I read from the New English Translation, which is the Bible there in front of you, and also the Bible that'll be on the screen. You can follow along there. You can follow along on whatever Bible or app you might be using. John chapter 9, verses 35 through 41. Let us hear the word of God together. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, so he found the man and said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man replied, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus told him, "You have seen him. He is the one speaking with you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that those who do not see may gain their sight, and the ones who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and asked him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus replied, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now because you claim that you can see, your guilt remains." The word of God for the people of God. And the people of God said, "Thanks be to God." Amen. You all may be seated. We are in this series called Come and See. And each week we want to bring forth through the Gospel of John either the way Jesus self-defines himself or the way the evangelist John writes about Jesus in regard to his own identity and nature. And each week, as we talk about who Jesus is, we hopefully are coming to this place where we either choose to believe in the claim that Jesus makes, or we choose to not believe or to struggle to believe in that. And as John says in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, the purpose of his gospel is that through these signs you might see who Jesus is, and you might believe that he is the Son of God and he is the Messiah. And so as we get into this story, there's one way that Jesus self-defines himself, which is a little redundant, but the way he defines himself here in John chapter 8 that I want to spend some time talking about. But as I was developing this sermon for this morning, I started to realize that there's more to this message that I felt like goes away from his identity as the Son of Man and just talks about our response to Jesus. And so that's where we're going to spend a bulk of our time this morning, and we're going to end together with communion. This story in chapter 9, the passage we read, comes at the tail end of a moment where Jesus heals a man who was born blind. Jesus' disciples are walking up to this relatively popular area in Jerusalem, and there is a beggar and a guy who's been blind from birth. And Jesus comes up to him, and the disciples begin to ask questions. Jesus, why is this man blind? Is it because he sinned? Is it because somebody in his family sinned? It was a pretty common idea that people who struggled in sin, or people who struggled with physical issues, were specifically resultant of some sin in their lives or the lives of their family. And Jesus says it wasn't him or his family who sinned, but this is so that you might see the glory of God. And Jesus spits into some dirt, makes it into mud, wipes it on the eyes of this gentleman and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And as he goes, he washes and he begins to gain his sight. And as he sees the world, people start to murmur about him. Is this the man that we always used to see begging? Isn't this the man that was blind, that we've known for 30 some odd years and he was blind? And they have this debate about it. And once they realize that this is him, he actually gets called in front of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a group of religious leaders. And the heartbeat of the Pharisees is that if the people of God upheld a high enough standard to the law, then the Messiah, who they perceived the Messiah to be, would come and restore their favor in the world. And so seeing that this healing took place on a Sabbath, which is Jesus' second time of healing somebody on the Sabbath, they wanted to ask more questions about who it was that healed this man or what it is that happened. And so they bring him to them and they start to ask the question, "Are you the one who was blind for so many years?" And he's like, "Yeah, that was me." "Okay, well, who healed you?" He's like, "I don't know who he was. Did you catch the point that I was blind? Like, I couldn't see him." You missed that. And so they send him off because he didn't give them the answer they need, and because they didn't find what they wanted in his story, and he didn't even know who Jesus was. They bring in this guy's parents. And the parents come in, and they were afraid of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, because they had the power to kick them out of the synagogue, to expel them from their local community. And so they come before the Pharisees, and they start asking the same questions. "Okay, is this your son?" "Yeah, that's our son." Was he always blind? Yes, he was always blind. Did you know he got healed? Yeah, we also can see that. Well, who healed him? And they're like, don't ask me. He's old enough. Ask him. And so he comes back again, the blind man who's now been healed. He comes back and he still doesn't really know who Jesus is. And they start to ask him and he says, oh, are you all interested in my healing because you also want to become one of his disciples? If you want to say something that's going to irritate the Pharisees more, I'm not sure there's a longer list than that one right there. And so they respond to him because he has this profound, like he's an incredibly unlearned person. He's pretty low on the rung of society. He's ostracized. He's not had any reason to understand these deep truths that these Pharisees should know. But here's his response, actually, in chapter 9, verses 30 through 33. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to godly persons who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. You see, there's something happening that's deeper than maybe the surface level in this moment. It's really easy in the Gospel of John to get caught in the simple physical realities. If you were with us on Wednesday night in our Bible study, I spent more time kind of understanding this. But there's this moment where Jesus feeds 5,000 men and probably another 3,000 to 5,000 women and children with just 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish. And in that moment, there's a physical reality that's taking place. But Jesus is always pushing us to move past the tangible to that which is spiritual. He uses this imagery to tell the story of him being the bread of life, to which if you partake in his body, you'll never be hungry again. In the same way, in John chapter 4, there's this moment where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well, and the whole conversation revolves around water, because there's a well. And he even asks her, will you get me something to drink? And you don't have a bucket, you don't have a pail, how are you supposed to get water? And Jesus says, if you'd asked me, I would give you living water, and you would never thirst again. You see, Jesus is moving always past the tangible to that which is spiritual. The same thing is taking place in this story this morning. Jesus is after something more in this moment. It's not simply about the restoration of this man's sight. It's about how he is going to help others to see him. And in the way you actually see him is by being blind. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the Pharisees throw him out. Jesus encounters him, and he says to them what we read earlier, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man who was born blind replied, who is he, sir, that I might believe in him? Jesus told him, you have seen him. He is the one who is speaking to you. One of the things that continually happens in the Gospel of John is Jesus reveals himself or is revealed to those who do not earn it nor deserve it. The Samaritan woman at the well is somebody who in every stretch of the imagination, and we'll get to her story in a few weeks, but every part of her story, she is unworthy of the revelation of Jesus the Messiah. A man born blind, like I said, most people would have thought he himself or his family, as the Pharisees reiterated, were steeped in sin. That's what caused his reality. But he's one that Jesus is revealed to. And we know it throughout the rest of the gospel story. If you go back through Matthew, Mark, Luke, every time that Jesus reveals himself to somebody, it's not the ones you would assume on a first glance would be the one worthy of it, but it's almost always the ones who are deeply unworthy of it. So on the first basic level, that's good news for us. Is that Jesus is revealing himself time and time again in the gospel stories to people like you and me. Now, some of you in the room maybe start taking offense of that. Well, I would be more on the Pharisee side of it. Well, the Lord help you. We'll walk through that here in just a minute. But there's this moment, and I debated this because Jesus proclaims his name to this blind man who's been healed. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? The Son of Man is Jesus' favorite phrase to declare who he is. He calls himself the Son of Man 65 times in the gospel, 13 times in the Gospel of John, especially, it is without question the number one way that Jesus self-identifies, the Son of Man. And for somebody in the first century, but especially a Jewish person, really over the course of their whole history, if you hear somebody defining themselves as the Son of Man, you're going to be drawn to a prophetic image that Daniel had from Daniel chapter 7. And I won't get too deep into it, but to boil down who the Son of Man was and an understanding of the Jewish way of using that word, he was the deliverer. He was the Messiah. He was the rescuer of the people of God. He had a unique relationship to the Father, but it was also someone who was a unique human. So there's a lot to really spend time talking about when we elevate the language of Son of Man, but I just want to be very frank with you. It's too much, and it would feel far more like a lecture than it would a sermon. So I invite you to come Wednesday nights, little plug. I'll be teaching through this chapter on Wednesday night, and I'm going to talk a lot more about the Son of Man. But I want to help you just kind of maybe narrow down to see that the Son of Man, this imagery and language that Jesus is using about himself, is about the one who will come to rescue the people of God. But bigger than that is not only does he come to rescue the people of God, he has come to bring forth a new family of Abraham who will know God intimately because God dwells with his people. We see this making its way out in the Son of Man and his earthly ministry, his way of being. Every story in the Gospel of John and all the other Gospels, when Jesus encounters somebody, there's a rescue, there's a redemption, there's a salvation moment. His earthly ministry was exemplifying his identity as the Son of Man. We see it personified in his death and resurrection. This suffering is where we see the Son of Man in his glory. John especially emphasizes the glorification of Jesus as the cross is raised up. We see the work of the Son of Man of bringing redemption and salvation to the world in his death and resurrection. We see the salvation and rescue of the Son of Man in the eventual return of Jesus that we wait for with anticipation. The time when Jesus will come again, as we often have said in our Apostles' Creed, to judge both the living or the quick and the dead. Those are the three ways we see the earthly and eternal mission of the Son of Man working its way out. And that's who the Son of Man is. And the question before you, once again, is do you believe? Do you believe in who Jesus says that he is? But I want to maybe help take this imagery of the Son of Man and make it even more personal for us this morning. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, about a wee little man named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, highly despised in the first century, because in the first century, and some of you may already know this, but the first century, most common folk were taxed multiple times before they ever got to see their money. The Romans would take their share, the Herodians would take their share, the temple would take their share, and then people were just left. And often what would happen is these tax collectors would use processes, and they would do things unfairly, so much so that they were one of the most despised people in the entire world to a first century Jew. And there's this little guy named Zacchaeus. Jesus is walking through. Zacchaeus has heard many things about him. And so Zacchaeus climbs a sycamore tree. Jesus comes down and he sees him. One of the simplest things that Luke is mentioning in that moment that I think also goes back to how we started this time is Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus, but Jesus saw Zacchaeus. Just in the same way that maybe sometimes in your life you've wondered where Christ was, but you must come to grow to understand that Jesus always sees you. So he invites Zacchaeus down. He says, today I'm going to eat in your house, which I can imagine if any of you are ever hosting something like a Super Bowl party and somebody tells you the day of that you're coming over, probably would add some stress to your life. Well, think about that being the Savior of the universe. So Zacchaeus brings Jesus to his house, and Zacchaeus is just cut to his heart, cut to the core of his being, and he begins to repent and just confess to Jesus that I've wronged people, and I'm going to return everything I've wronged, and I'm going to give away even more of my stuff to people who need it. And Jesus looks at him. It's unbelievable that Jesus would say this to a tax collector, but he says, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. And then in verse 10, if you want to know who the Son of Man is or what the Son of Man has come to do, this is what Jesus says in verse 10 of chapter 19 in the Gospel of Luke. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So if all of the other conversations that I've talked about when it comes to the Son of Man just kind of flew over your head or is a little too in the weeds, what I hope you can at least catch for this morning is that the purpose of the Son of Man is to seek and save the lost. To seek and save the lost. So, what I want to help us kind of look at is who are the lost ones? Who are the ones who need to be saved? And what I hope, as you maybe hear a little bit or understand this, or maybe you're already deeply aware of that, is the answer is all of us are lost and need to be found by Jesus. So how do you get there? How do you get there? One of the things that's important to remember about the story in the Gospel of John is this one story of the blind man who received his sight, who heard about Jesus and gave his life in belief of Jesus. This is a symbolic story that really sums up the whole purpose of John's Gospel. Is that each one of these stories, every single one of these moments, is to give you an encounter with Christ and ask you, do you believe in the Son of Man? But Jesus, he's teaching something even deeper. And the Pharisees asked that question. Pharisees asked that question, so are we blind? He says, no, if you were blind, you'd be able to see. But if now that you claim that you can see, you actually are blind. And I'm sure everybody left going, what? Right? Like, Jesus says something. We can be real. Like, Jesus says some things where you leave and you're just like, I don't know what he just said, right? So if we're blind, we can see, but if we can see, we're actually blind. But I can see, so hold on. Did he just say we're blind and then Jesus is already gone, right? But he's saying something far deeper than that, and he's talking about spiritual blindness. You see, the most regular conflict that Jesus is in the Gospels is with those who think they have the answers. The most regular conflict that Jesus finds himself in the Gospels is with those who think they have the answers. The most regular tension that Jesus finds himself in the Gospels is with those who think that on their own they can be saved. That on their own they're perfectly put together and they have all the answers and all the right parts. And for you and I, whether or not we acknowledge it, sometimes we dip our toes into that way of thinking as well. But I want to encourage you this morning to be blind. To be blind. To have in your mind and in your heart a realization that on your own you cannot save yourself. To recognize and remember your need. One of the things I've said before here is that you cannot heal that which is hidden. The things in your heart that are broken, the things in your soul that steal your joy, they must be brought to the sunshine, to the outside. They must be brought into the world so that God can do the work of restoring them and healing them. And to take that just one step further is you cannot be healed if you don't understand that you are fundamentally broken. You cannot be healed if you don't actually think you need to be healed. So, less and less do people ask me what happened to my neck. I have a giant scar that actually starts on the back of my neck and works its way to about the center of my neck. And people don't ask about it, mainly because most of you are so holy that you don't look at outward appearances, but you simply look at that which is in the heart, and I appreciate that so much. But many of you sometimes don't even think about it, and a lot of you have actually just been like, well, I just feel like that's a little invasive for me to ask what happened to him. So when I was 21 years old, me and a group of friends that I was in a band with, we went out to a friend's uncle's land, and they had four-wheelers, right? Mistake number one. I don't belong on a four-wheeler. I haven't been on one before nor after this moment in 2003. And we were riding these four-wheelers, and I was just super uncomfortable immediately, right? Like the handling is just, I just wasn't ready for the fact that it kind of moves abruptly if you don't know what you're doing. And so I was just kind of like cruising and like taking it easy. I'm pretty risk adverse by nature anyway. And so I'm taking it easy and I come over this hill and there's a barbed wire fence that's running this way and I'm over here and I'm like, hey, listen, don't turn too abruptly because then you could maybe roll the four-wheeler or throw yourself off of it into the fence. And so instead I made the decision just to run into the fence. For real. I had 70 stitches in my neck, rolled my ankle. And the crazy part about that story, for some of you, I didn't think about the fact that some of you might get queasy, so we don't have any barf bags. I apologize about that. But I get up, and my friend Brian Webb, he actually plays bass here on Sunday mornings. We were in the same band, and he was on the four-wheeler behind me. And so he kind of watched me do all of this, and he watched me stand up, and I was like, I think I'm okay. For real, like adrenaline had just kicked in and I was like, I think I'm all right. And I just see like all the blood run out of Brian's face. Because not to get graphic, but I just hit a barbed wire fence and pulled my body across it. And he goes, you are not okay. And so I went to like the Claremore Hospital and this nurse, it was like, they just pulled her, like she normally is a veterinarian tech. And she came in and like stitched my neck together. I'm just like, that's the best you got? Like, what was it? I was like, sorry, don't be an idiot. You get the better doctors. But I think that specific story is maybe telling a larger story for us. Is many of us walk through our lives as if we're okay. But the truth is we're very much not okay. And the first step to spiritual reformation is that inward journey of recognizing that you're not okay. I was talking to a friend of mine who's super active in recovery ministries, and anybody that's walked through recovery ministries is familiar to this, is just the reality that every recovery ministry puts at the forefront is that we must acknowledge that we have a problem and then acknowledge that we on our own cannot overcome that problem. You're going to be blown away by this, but that's rooted in the Gospels. Even though recovery ministries have deviated a little bit from being gospel or Jesus specific, that's where it's rooted in. And it's the same thing. To be spiritually blind is to think that you are okay on your own, but to be spiritually able to see is to acknowledge that without Jesus, you are irreparably broken. There's a passage I've been coming back to. This is from Dallas Willard wrote a book in the 90s and 2000s called Renovation of the Heart. I don't actually know when it was written. I think it was in the early 2000s. But I came across this. I have a devotional where every day it's going through like one of his kind of ideas from this book called Renovation of the Heart. And it's been a powerful journey so far. So much so for me that after Easter, the series we're going to enter into for probably a total of 8 weeks is going to be out of this book, Renovation of the Heart. But he said this passage that just, hit me in exactly where I needed to be hit for this morning. And it's going to be on the screen. I'm just going to read it for us. We must see the soul and the person in its ruined condition, with its malformed and dysfunctional mind, feelings, body, and social relations, before we can understand that it must be delivered and reformed and how that can be done. The path to spiritual transformation today lies through the illumination that we have ruined souls. This must be gratefully and humbly accepted and applied to oneself above all. We have to get over ourselves, to accept that without God we are truly ruined souls. Not, and I love this last point, not to feel shame, but to understand how much we need the power of God. There's a moment where Jesus heals a paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. It's earlier on in the Gospel of John, chapter 5. And there's this pool that every once in a while would just kind of get stirred up, and then a lot of people go in there felt like there was healing and restorative power in the pool. And Jesus comes up to this man. He's been paralyzed for 30 some odd years, and he asks him a question that feels problematic. He says that this man is paralyzed. Do you want to be well? Well, it feels like completely oblivious. Like, what do you mean, do I want to be well? Like, what do you think I'm here for, Jesus? Like, what do you mean, do I want to be well, right? But I've always thought that the reason John included this and the reason Jesus asked that question is because it's a question that still needs to be asked of us today. Do you want to be well? And the only way you're going to answer that question truthfully is if you realize that maybe, despite your best efforts, despite your best intentions, despite any accomplishment or failure in your life, is on your own, you cannot be made well. And Jesus, the Son of Man, has come not to call the righteous or those who think they can see, but those who cannot see, the sinners to repentance. I had this, I don't know why, man. The fact that the algorithms of social media are so effective at getting inside my brain just makes me concerned about every single thing in the world, including my own brain. But there's this video that has popped up on my timeline time and time again, and it's this story, and I had to kind of do some research to figure it out, but it's from 2014, and it was from Master Chef, the cooking show in Brazil. There's a young lady named Eliza Fernandez, and she was struggling to get a jar open. And she's in this competition. You have a timeline, right? Some of you have maybe seen this video. But as I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking about you and me, and I was thinking about what it means to be spiritually blind or having our eyes open because of Jesus' presence in our life, his love, mercy, and grace. I thought about this video. And so I thought, why would I tell you about it and not just show it to you? So let's watch this together.
Não consigo abrir. Não consegue abrir.
Eu não vou abrir a lata. Vai que dá, vai que dá.
Ah, beleza.
Vai que dá tempo, vamos lá.
Aí daqui que eu abro.
Enfia a faca embaixo.
Caramba, hein?
Fura a tampa, fura a tampa. Fura a tampa. Traz aqui, ó.
You see, hopefully it doesn't take a lot of effort for you to make the spiritual jump here, right? If you've ever find yourself taking all the steps, all the work of self-help and all the things you've been told by this person or that person that's going to get you to where you need to be or want to be, and you find yourself like that young lady trying to open the jar, but it's just not opening. My brother Jim mentioned this to me, is sometimes what you have to do when you can't do it on your own is you need to run to the Father. Those who are blind are the ones that can acknowledge that they can't open this up. And because of the grace, mercy, and love of Jesus Christ, he looks at the blind and he will take the spiritual mud and heal you. But it will not happen if you continue to try to do it in your own will or your own power. Can you imagine trying to open up a jar with a meat cleaver? Right? It's foolishness to us. But in the same way, we in our very broken state will try everything but Jesus to fix ourselves. And the only person that can do it is Jesus.